Hello and welcome everyone to our first Shaping Mobility webinar in 2021. I'm happy to see so many of you joining this webinar from so many countries today. My name is Christian Haas. I'm the CEO of PTV Group and I'll be your host for today. Before we start, please see a few housekeeping notes that appear now on the chat on your screen. So today's webinar will be about urban air mobility. I think that's a super hot topic that's obviously been discussed a lot in the recent year. And to start, we prepared a little video that we're going to show you now, and the main course will start right after that. Well, the world is changing in such a fascinating way. I mean, the world of mobility. And let me introduce our panelists for today. Thank you very much for joining. From California, we've got Jessie Mowbray, who's an expert on commercial UAV. She's currently a senior technology and innovation advisor at the Flight Safety Foundation. Before that, Jessie served as the head of deployment at Airbus Innovation Unit in Silicon Valley and was the co-author of a major report on public perception of urban air mobility. As a fun fact, Jessie was one of the first to obtain a commercial drone license in the US. Welcome, Jessie. We've got Rolf Frisch. Rolf is a senior business development manager at Volocopter, the German air taxi pioneer. He oversees strategic partnerships and cooperation with European cities and leads the development of an intelligent urban air mobility software platform called Volo IQ. Rolf is a civil engineer by education, has vast experience in the area of intelligent transportation systems, and is a huge fan of sustainable traffic concepts. Welcome, Rolf.
Hello.
From the UK, we're joined by Philip Butterworth-Hayes, a writer and broadcaster on drone and urban air mobility topics. He's a publisher of unmannedairspace.info and urbanairmobilitynews.com and is a director of communications and strategy at the Civic Air Transport Association. Welcome, Philip. Last but not least, we've got Felix Töpsch, who leads Frankfurt Airport's program for urban air mobility and unmanned aviation. The program successfully integrated drones into everyday aviation at Frankfurt Airport and developed the airport's business models for future forms of aviation, especially air taxis and unmanned aircraft. Welcome, Felix. Thank you very much again to all of you for joining. Let's start with the first question right away. You know, urban air mobility is not really new. We've seen urban air mobility for decades already, really, with large cities like Sao Paulo, for example, New York and others using urban air mobility in the forms of helicopters already. Jessie, you know, maybe you can explain to us what is the difference between helicopters and what we're talking about in today's session, VTOL, etc. And what do our participants have to understand, you know, in terms of the difference for both?
Yeah, that's a great question. Christian, I think to answer that, we have to go back a step and ask, you know, when we talk about urban air mobility, what are we really talking about? Are we including small drones? Is this just passenger carrying aircraft? You know, some people talk about urban air mobility as just being these large autonomous people-carrying aircraft, and other people talk about them as also being the drones that may deliver packages in our city. So I guess sort of my definition of urban air mobility is really just what's flying in our urban airspaces, which would be inclusive of both of those. Now, if we hone more in on sort of the passenger carrying aspect of these VTOL aircraft, something that's generally distinctive is some of the more autonomous nature of these aircraft, as well as a lot of the manufacturers that are talking about it are talking about electric aircraft for their, their flying cars or their passenger carrying aircraft. But that's probably also a good question for Ralph. He could probably talk a little bit more about volocopters, difference between what they're doing versus what sort of a more traditional helicopter manufacturer is doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And, maybe Ralph can tell us about the difference between the volocopters and the volodrones as well. So, Ralph, what is the current situation in the urban air mobility industries? And maybe you can touch a little bit on the points Jesse and I discussed just before.
I think it's quite exciting times, so there is currently the shift that the people realize that the future is right now. So it is not 10 years away of us, it will be within next year. So we have communicated, and we are currently doing that, to set up services in Paris as well as in Singapore within the next 3 years. So we're currently on the way to get the type certification for our aircraft that we then will afterwards will be able also to transport passengers within cities. And I think this is quite exciting times for all of us.
Absolutely. But, we're talking about, right now we're talking about the transportation of passengers specifically. Do we think, Philip, that, those volocopters, for example, will be massively used, or will that remain something like the helicopters we've been seeing before in cities like New York, for example, as well? Only a few people will use.
That's another great question. I think this industry it'll have to be affordable. So in other words, it will be a completely new type of industry, a new type of urban way of getting around cities. So it's going to have to be in the grasp of the local community, and it has to be supported by the local community, because the aviation industry just can't do it by itself. And that's one of the many big cultural differences that we're facing. I think the engineering problems of making sure these platforms are safe is one thing. Getting community engagement, making sure that people are supporting it and people can see the benefits in their daily lives of this new type of flying is going to be as equally challenging, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we're talking about the acceptance of people, obviously that has something to do with, enabling the necessary infrastructure to do that. Felix, what do you think needs to be done in terms of infrastructure to get to a point where we have a mass urban air mobility system? And obviously you're talking from an airport's perspective, and Frankfurt is my hometown, so I'm very interested to hear what you're planning.
When we look at the traditional aviation infrastructure, basically on airports, we have that tradition for decades, and the infrastructure that developed over years and continuously expanded with increasing numbers of passengers. And what UAM gives us the chance to rethink the airport design completely, because the main benefit for air taxi customers, from my point of view, is our time savings. And when you think of traveling from a traditional airport, the most uncomfortable part is being there 1 hour prior to your departure, having that heavy security check, long ways within the terminal, and that are all things that we should make more efficient for vertiport design, and that's what our goal is.
Yeah, absolutely. And question to Ralph. Volocopter recently announced its commitment in Singapore and also a participation in Paris. Can you explain a little bit what exactly you're planning to do in those cities?
Okay, let me start with Singapore. So in 2019, we had the public flight in the Marina Bay, so during the ITS 2019. So there we already started the discussions with the CAS, so this is the Civil Aviation Authority in Singapore, as well as EDB, Economic Board, and so on. MOT, so the Department of Transportation, to set up already the first steps that we can then follow our approach. We're currently doing so. We have established an own subsidiary in Singapore with Hon, our director in Asia Pacific, and he's permanently talking to set up within the next 3 years our first operations in Singapore. We will start there with a touristic route, so close to the Marina Bay, what we in the same area we have already flown in 2019. But then elaborate this more and more and come to also flights from I think also over the country there to combine it over the overseas. That could be an interesting destination. What we are planning there. We want to really scale up the business, so we plan up to 50 pilots in the next years, bring up to 200 people to our subsidiary there. So really starting the process, operating then that we have within the next year the operation. Paris, we have communicated last year that we will be part of a test bed in Pontoise. So this is a test area. There was additionally also an official tender where the Paris region as well as RATP and the airport of Paris, ADP, were looking for participants, and there was now communicated on the 18th of December that there were 30 winners. We won one of the winners to participate in that exercise. And within 2021, we are now thinking about the vehicle development. So, for example, what is about the batteries, urban infrastructure, the operations, how could they look like, airspace integration, as well as also acceptability. So how will the people accept those kind of services? But of course, the goal is 2024 Olympic Games. So that there will already when the Olympic Games will start, that there will be already a volocopter service in place.
And now apart from the Olympics, Philip, what do you think? And that's something I'm personally thinking about a lot as well, because I'm fascinated by the idea. And when I saw the volocopter, which is close to the volocopter headquarters, which is close to Karlsruhe and PTV's headquarter, I was thrilled, I have to say. But I keep thinking about on a daily basis, how is that going to change life in cities if that becomes kind of new normal?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, everybody has this dream of the skies above cities being black with drones and flying volocopters and personal transports and all sorts of other exotic aeroplanes are going to take to the skies. I don't think that's quite going to happen quite like that. I'm not quite sure this is a mass urban transit system. It is a discrete transport system, so it can't be the CEO just getting out of his office and climbing up to the penthouse and flying to the first class lounge. It can't be that, but neither can it replace the metro. So it's somewhere in between, and I think where exactly in between is where, and I come back again to where the community decides what it wants, and every city will have a different view about what it wants.
Yeah, one interesting thing, when I Googled about urban air mobility, it was the description on Wikipedia, and why urban air mobility was invented. It was to reduce congestion as well. And, that's a question I'm asking myself, to which extent will that really reduce congestion? I mean, I can't imagine that at the time people were thinking just by having a few helicopters flying around New York, that will heavily reduce congestion. And I still struggle a little bit with the idea, but it very much, I guess, depends on what you just said, the general acceptance. But question to Jesse, when we talk about acceptance, obviously that has a lot to do with concerns as well. And Philip was just mentioning the concerns of people having those black, drones and volocopters everywhere, in terms of the sky is black. You said, I think you said it, Philip. So what do you think are the general concerns of people, because obviously there are a lot of advantages in terms of sustainability as well. If we look at the way Volocopter is planning it, what do you think are the concerns?
Yeah, so I definitely would agree with Philip. So Airbus put out a study in 2018 talking about how many aircraft we could potentially anticipate above an urban city center similar to Paris. And so they did this based off of more of what they projected the demand to be. And so they said that, there might be over 15,000 delivery drones in the skies. There might be 60 inspection drones. There could be a doubling of commercial aircraft from about 80 today to 156 by 2035. And then for urban air mobility vehicles, based on their projected demand, there could be 2,500 per hour. Now, I know that obviously the infrastructure, I think they knew that the infrastructure necessarily wouldn't support this, but just based off demand, if we're talking about that sort of diversity of aircraft and density, and that does sound a little bit closer to what Philip was talking about the darkening of the skies. So my team in 2019 did a study of the public perception of adoption of urban air mobility vehicles. We pulled 1,500 people from around the world, focusing on 4 different jurisdictions. So LA, Mexico City, Switzerland, and New Zealand. And unsurprisingly, the most congested cities were the most excited about urban air mobility vehicles flying there to relieve some of the congestion. So Mexico City was most excited about the topic, followed by LA, New Zealand, and then Switzerland. We found out that younger folks were more excited than older generations. Men tended to be more excited than women. And the top 5 safety concerns were, the safety of individuals on the ground, the type of sound, the volume of sound, the time of day these flights were flying, and then also what altitude were they flying. So, this is just an initial study and a lot more work needs to be done, but over 50% of people were excited to see urban air mobility vehicles flying in their city. So that's a pretty good starting point. And that's before you sit down with the community and do workshops and really walk through what are their hopes and dreams and expectations and worries. So I think we're off to a pretty good start as an industry.
Yeah, absolutely. And, at the end, it comes down to education and transparency too, and, like all the time. But, one question to Felix, obviously, when you think about that from a Frankfurt Airport perspective, setting up services and so on, what, in your view, is an ideal coverage of UAM within a city?
You mean where we would like to have vertiports located?
Where, how many, etc. Where do you draw the line?
I think what is limiting the area of operating is the battery technology at the moment. So we have some air taxi concepts that try to reach up to a few hundred kilometers. And then there are more interurban concepts like the Volocopter that aims to connect people within a radius of about up to 35 kilometers. So I think those are two ways, and we of course one way is to just increase our catchment area as an airport and to make coming to an airport and going from an airport to downtown areas make more comfortable via using air taxis. But on the other hand, when we think about the longer VTOL flight routes, those are that could be an alternative to a traditional domestic flight like we know today. And when we think about COVID-19, we in general expect the number of domestic flights to decrease in the coming years. And in addition to that, if there is an alternative to, for example, a normal flight from Frankfurt to Berlin, where you have to go to an airport, do the security check, all the things I just mentioned before. But you could also choose taking a VTOL that departs right before your door at your local main station, for example. We as an airport, we should look at this business model to also not only focus on the traditional airport, but also, for example, develop and operate those vertiports that are more decentralized in the downtown areas.
Exactly. And, you know, my question was a little bit referring to, you know, obviously, you know, the battery has something to do with the limitations from a technology perspective, you know, the battery power, etc. And I'm sure that that's going to get fixed at some point too. But in reality, probably, I guess, you know, what we'll be seeing first is, you know, those volocopters flying from, you know, Frankfurt Airport into the city. And my question was a little bit related to, you know, we've seen that in the introductory video, those volopods, and how many volopods will we initially have in the city when such a service starts? Is that, you know, we'll have one on every skyscraper, or will we have one or two? You know, what do you, and that's a little bit what I was referring to in terms of coverage.
I don't know exactly, but if I would have to have an expectation is that what our vision of urban air mobility is not a private to everybody to have a private vertiport in his garden, and that it is accessible for everyone and not only for the rich ones working in the high towers here in Frankfurt. So we expect those vertiports to be at public places, for example. When you're familiar with Frankfurt, one place could be our main train station, or right the downtown where all shops are, Konstabler Wache, for example. That could be possible locations for vertiports, I think.
So basically, you know, those points which we would now identify anyway as, you know, the new mobility hubs, I guess, right? Like, you know, you see the main train station, etc.
I mean, we saw it in a video. It's not only about a building just for VTOL, but you have to go there by any other mobility solution, like those electric scooters we saw in the video, or trains, car sharing, whatever is the most suitable for you.
Yeah, exactly. And those will be all then, I guess, firmly integrated into the new mobility ecosystem as we all envisage it for the future. But, you know, before we come talking about the, sorry, Ralph, please.
Christian, maybe just one thing to add is what I think could also work quite well is parking garages in the inner city, because normally they are very in the center of a city. They have the infrastructure, so there is power supply. And I think it's relatively easy to say, okay, let's use the roof for a different purpose and still use the other elements there, maybe traditionally. So I think this is something what could have a good perspective as well.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, before we're going to start talking about, at least a little bit talking about the transportation of goods, because we've been talking about transportation of people so far, and I'd like to touch on the transportation of goods, you know, where we mentioned drones at the beginning. I'd like to ask one more question to Philip in regards to regulatory challenges. You know, what do we expect in terms of, you know, will governments or will cities play an important part there, or how do we imagine that that's going to happen, and what's happening actually now in that regard?
If you ask the question, who owns the airspace above a city, you won't get one answer around the world. Every city will have a different answer, and every state will have a different answer, and every country will have a different answer. So we're starting at ground zero, really. We don't know. Nobody has done this before. This is a completely new type of transport system. So it's important to get the basics right. And the key issue is I think, the next steps, because the next few years are going to decide how each city goes about this, and getting the city authorities to work with the aviation regulators and the technology providers to sit down and work these things out. And there is a set of sequential steps that have to be started. And the first thing is, who owns that city? Who's responsible for the safety of these operations? Is it the aviation authority? Is it the city? Is it the operator? What about the environmental consequences? You know, I mean, all these issues are huge, and they haven't really been tackled yet, but they will have to be fast-tracked over the next few months and years before this industry can really mature.
I agree. I've been looking a little bit on the questions from the audience, and I'll get that back to that in a minute as well, because they deal a lot with regulatory requirements and so on. But, you know, a quick question to Ralph. You know, on a day-to-day basis, obviously, you know, you deal with that on a daily basis. You know, what is your perception on that? you know, how do governments and, you know, authorities currently deal with those aspects?
I would just first have a spot or take the opportunity to say, hey, this is the momentum. I think what is the bad thing of COVID? Yeah, we all suffer under that, but the positive thing is that it really drives digitalization. And I think this could be a chance, as well as, for example, autonomous driving on the streets. So we're getting more and more sensors on the streets that, of course, in the long run could also help the airspace, so that we get, I totally agree, Philip, that is a difficult question, but I think it needs to be to a certain way controlled and also then digitally controlled. But I think now it is the chance to do so and to set all the things up. I think we are also thinking that kind of direction. Christian, you mentioned the Volo IQ at the very beginning. I think this is the first step, that we are building this platform to bring all data together. Of course, also sensor data, connectivity, and so on, that and I think this is the most important thing for us. We want to have a safe flight within the city. This is the prerequisite for everything.
Yeah, I completely agree. And then, you know, I just, you know, talked about it before. So, you know, on the one hand, we've got obviously the transportation of people and, you know, the volocopters. And then on the other hand, and on top, let's say, we've got the drones for the transportation of goods, because, you know, it's obviously also being said that drones will have a significant impact on the logistics business going forward. We know about, you know, the large players obviously testing it out already. You know, my first question is, what comes first, Jesse? Is it the drones or is it the transportation of people? What we will see first, and then I'm looking at the questions out of the audience, and I think maybe we can combine that a little bit. You know, when we see drones, volocopters coming up, etc., what does that mean for, you know, how are we going to deal with noise pollution, for example? How do we have to imagine that?
Yeah, so I think one aspect of it we've already hit on, which each city is going to look different. Each city citizens have different needs, and, you know, some cities might decide that they want their skies blue and they won't allow anybody to fly around. And some cities may decide that they would like to ease congestion and that this would be a great way to go about it. And then there's probably some cities that will set congestion limits. And so if there's a great, for example, metro system in a city, maybe they'll decide that, you know, air taxis are not a useful addition to their transportation system, but maybe their roads are super congested from delivery vehicles and motorcycles, and that delivery drones would actually be of huge benefit. So I think it's really going to look different. And another challenge is that regulation is not being rolled out in the same way across the world for drones as well as for larger air taxis. And so some places will regulate in a certain way and others will regulate in another way. And so, you know, some will be more city driven, like the city of LA and Paris and Singapore are very, you know, they're quick adopters in this terms of autonomous flying technology. But there will be other cities, for example, cities that have kicked cars out of their cities that are going to say, no, we don't want this. You know, we want to keep our space open. So I think it's going to be really interesting over the next couple of years to see what happens and how it happens and where it happens.
Philip, do you see a dependence on, you know, the regulators in terms of, you know, what comes first, Volo drones or, you know, drones or copters and so on?
I think the problem is the regulators don't know. So the regulators are aviation people, and they know about jets and they know about flying big aeroplanes. But how many regulators around the world can safely regulate a blockchain kind of based system or something based on an IoT, you know, Internet of Things? I mean, there aren't any regulators really capable at the moment of saying how some of these autonomous technologies should be used. So one of the problems that we've got is that we all have to understand the potential of these technologies, including the regulators. So when I say we're starting at ground zero, we are starting at ground zero because this has never been done before. Most of the time in aviation, we've got a good database of facts you know, of experiences, and we can build on that. This is the first time we've come across a revolution like this, and it is a revolution. And this is what makes it so different and exciting, to see how we all work together, because I think the benefits are just so clear and so obvious. We have to do it, but we just don't know how to do it yet. But I think we'll start to find out, you know, in the next couple of months or years, how to do it.
Yeah, and I think probably there's also going to be a dependence whether we're talking about manned or unmanned, right? It's a little bit with the autonomous vehicles, with safety drivers, without safety drivers, etc. I think there's a dependency. If we're talking about timelines as well, I mean, we've seen Vodocopters already flying in Singapore, for example, and in other major cities around the globe. Ralph, I think they were manned. They were with a pilot.
No, not necessarily. So in Singapore, it was manned. In Stuttgart, we flew at the Mercedes-Benz Museum. It was unmanned, so there was a remote pilot on the ground, as well as in Helsinki. So there we flew manned again. So we can do both.
Okay, and we have a question out of the US, if I just come back, which I find quite interesting, Jesse, and maybe that's a question for you. Are there any plans to support potential operators in the United States with Federal Aviation Administration certification?
Yes, so the FAA is working on a couple different certification schemes. So they're working on certification schemes for drones. They just came up with 4 categories of drones, one of which will have to be Part 131 certified. And then for urban air mobility vehicles that were carrying people, there's an entirely different certification scheme. So, you know, we have a couple, there's the commercial drone certification scheme under Part 121. But I think the challenge is if you're Part 121 certified to fly commercial drones, they have to be under 55 kilos or 25 kilos. Fact check me on that. But that's a very different type of operation than a much more risky Part 131 certification or where you're carrying people around. So I guess check the certification scheme, and I'm happy to talk to you more about it after the webinar as well.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much, Jesse. There's another question. I think that's a question probably to Ralph, you know, in regards to, and probably to Felix too, so maybe you can give an answer in regards to pricing of those flights. How are you approaching that? Because that's obviously also a question. There's a strong dependency on how many people are going to use it. How are you approaching that topic?
Can I take it, Felix?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, so on the long run, we are aiming at a price that is comparable to, I would call it a premium taxi, not a normal taxi, but a premium taxi. So like a black cab, for example, in the US. But under circumstances that we will fly autonomously, so they don't have the pilot on board. So this is in the long run. I think this is also why our target would be to fly in big cities, in really mega cities, because I think then we could help to improve the traffic situation, and this is also our goal there. But it should be affordable for anybody. Yes, I don't know if a taxi is affordable for anybody on a permanent way, but this is the target, that it is not something for the very rich who can then afford it, and we fly from Nizza to I don't know where. So, but it should be really a contribution to improve mobility and many in big cities, in mega cities.
Yeah, I agree.
Sorry.
Yeah,
airport operator too. We don't directly have an impact on the ticket price, of course, because when we transfer our know-how of an infrastructure provider, our customer would be companies like, or manufacturers like Vodocopter, Lilium, and Co. So we don't exactly impact the ticket price in the end.
Yeah, you know, from a PTV perspective, obviously we're very much involved and closely working with cities all over the globe in regards to how mobility is evolving, etc. And what we've been seeing recently, you know, also triggered by COVID to a large extent, you know, the rise of biking, etc. The public discussions we're seeing, people want to walk, etc. want to, you know, some cities want to ban cars out of the city centers, etc. So we are seeing, you know, in terms of, you know, Philip, you said revolution in regards to urban air mobility, but I think we're seeing a revolution in general in regards to, you know, mobility within urban city centers. And we've got a question from the audience, which I find very interesting, and I'm just going to read it to you. What problem is this trying to solve, urban air mobility? If we all agreed on that it isn't a mass transit solution, how is it going to help solve congestion? It feels like this is a solution looking for problem, or to be a bit harsher, it's a gimmick and a distraction. We know what works in cities: mass transit, walking, and cycling. What do you think, Jesse? Or Philip, you go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that one of the results of COVID is that they've been able to use drones to take much needed medicines from medical centers to remote communities to people and drop them in the back garden and take them back. And the cost of doing that is $1. So if you use a drone to do that delivery, or say 1 or 2 miles to somebody who can't move, the cost of that is $1. If you put that on the back of a small motorcycle, the cost would be about what, $15, $20. So that in itself shows the potential financial benefits you can get from this, and it also shows how it can start to link communities in new ways. That's slightly different from flying passengers around, but it's part of the same kind of parabola. It's part of the same industry where, until you actually start looking and seeing these things flying and start understanding the technologies and understanding the potential for changing people's lives, then it's very difficult to quantify. But where we have seen that happen, we have seen some quite remarkable benefits in terms of linking people and linking places and cutting down transport costs.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
so we don't know, but I think potentially there are absolutely huge benefits from this.
Yeah, I agree, and I think, you know, we have to be looking at it, you know, not only from an urban perspective, because there are many other examples where drones can be used in a very efficient way, and you mentioned one from a medical perspective, for example, and that applies obviously to other parts of the world where we don't have big city centers, etc., and where that's still needed. So I think there are many very useful use cases, but I think the question is fair in regards to congestion, because we don't really know what impact it is going to have on congestion, and because there's a strong dependency on how actively it'll be used. Felix, I have a question for you, which also comes from the audience. How do you think the huge number of drones, and I think that applies both to the transportation of people and goods, will be managed, regulated, and controlled? Because obviously that's a perfect question for you from an airport perspective.
That's a good question. That is what we are trying to find out with our partners from Vodocopter and the German ATC DFS, because there definitely has to be a type of unmanned traffic management. And honestly, from my personal point of view, we should put that in responsible of our expert from the ATCs. They have an overview on air traffic, and I think they are able to also monitor unmanned traffics. And what I think is the most difficult part is to control departure and arrivals at vertiports or at airports, especially if they are as busy as the major European airports, for example, Frankfurt. Because there need to be extra room for new aircrafts. We cannot stop a traditional aircraft to fly to Frankfurt Airport just to put a VTOL into our operation. Yeah, so that should the capacity should be expanded.
Yeah, and when we talk about the traditional ways of air mobility, let's say, including helicopters, for example, in an urban context, or the airplanes landing at the Frankfurt airport, then we very quickly could come to a discussion around what we see on the mobility on the autonomous vehicle side as well, where we're discussing collisions, for example, in the mix of having autonomous vehicles versus driver driven vehicles, and how are we, you know, what do we think about that in terms of urban air mobility? In terms of the collisions, etc. How are we going to prevent that?
I would love to hand this question over to Ralf, for example, because I think that is basically a more technical question, because I think that with an increasing number of unmanned traffic, we definitely have to rely on technical solutions as see and avoid systems, for example.
I agree. I'd like to pass it over actually to both Jesse, you and Ralf. So whoever wants to go first.
Jesse, please.
Yeah, sure. So I think there's a couple of different things to hit on here. Is there is rapidly evolving regulation around UTM and U-Space, both in Europe and the US and many other places around the world. And generally, this federated airspace management scheme has been imagined for small UAS, but there's a lot of research about how could we also use this for larger urban air mobility vehicles and passenger aircraft as well. And so essentially the concept is a service based architecture, which is federated, which essentially means a series of data services, one that could tell you your weather, it could tell you where other people are flying right now, where they intend to be flying. It could tell you where you're allowed to fly, where you're not allowed to fly. And so it's just a series of services which support aircraft to fly. Right now in the US, the conflict resolution is aircraft to aircraft. So if the intended 4D trajectories overlap, then they negotiate with themselves. I think in Europe, it's probably going to be a bit more centralized in terms of, I think Eurocontrol will want a little bit, and EASA will decide that there needs to be more a player of a more centralized person, whether it's an ANSP or perhaps a digital, ANSP entity. But I can see that this space is moving really, really quickly out of necessity because, a lot of these flights, unlike flights in the past, are not going to take off and land at an airport, which is very, very different. We essentially have airports in our cities on top of buildings, potentially out the window of an apartment complex. And so these schemes are all being worked through right now. But I guess what I can say that I think will happen is this architecture of data services will evolve to encompass not just UAS, but also manned autonomous aircraft carrying people and also be connected into the ATC system. We did a bit of a test where we took an air traffic control radar screen with like typical airport traffic, and then we started to put little drone ADS-Bs on the radar screen, and air traffic controllers were like, holy moly, I cannot, like this, I have enough on my workload right now, I cannot also manage these other aircraft and this additional complexity. And so it's going to have to be done through data services. There's no way humans are going to be able to manage this amount of traffic.
Yeah, agree. One thing, that was quite, everything was interesting, you said, but one thing in particular, because we talked a lot about, those volocopters and drones flying into the city, but you said, potentially they'll be flying outside the cities as well, into the outskirts, etc., and so on. And we've got a question from the audience in that respect, which is interesting in that respect, I think, and that deals with how are those drones going to cohabitate with, birds, for example, etc. And the more to the outskirts it gets, obviously, the more birds they're going to be. So how are we going to deal with that, Philip?
The answer is ultimately we have to use autonomy. And so this is too complex for humans to deal with. It's too complex, as Jesse just said, for a controller to look at a bit of airspace and try and control everything that goes on. So this whole business only works if it's autonomous. It's only by getting rid of the pilot, getting rid of the controller, getting the systems to talk to each other. First of all, looking at 5G networks, sharing data, and putting sensors up on buildings. So there's a massive data. So we're looking at big data, analytics, changing all the time, dynamic data, because we're going to get gusts of wind between skyscrapers. That's going to change things. We're going to get trains moving all over the place. So the huge, vast amounts of data required to underpin all this, they have to be validated. They have to be secure. They have to, they can't have criminals accessing it all. So we have to build this massive mesh network of validated data, all of which is integrated, all of which talks to each other, and all of which is based on like IoT and 5G and all sorts of these other things. So that has to underpin ultimately the wonderful volocopters that are flying in the sky.
Yeah, thank you very much. That leads me to another question, Ralph. Right now I think there are about two handful of very serious players around urban air mobility, as far as I can say. And how do you envisage the ownership models for that going forward in terms of the vehicles and the system itself? Because obviously Philip was just mentioning, Jesse was too, the challenges that we're going to have, a huge amount of data, etc. And if there's going to be a specific ownership models, whether it's for the vehicles or the ports or both, etc. Obviously those companies need to deal with that. How do you envision that?
Yeah, I will answer that in a minute. And Christian, I would just like to reply to Philip, because all what you said currently is the amount of data. This is currently what we also do additionally. I mentioned the VoloIQ. So this is what we are currently building together based on Microsoft Azure. So a cloud-based architecture to set up a platform with the help of Lufthansa Industry Solutions. So a very, very experienced player, what we have there also regarding aviation, to bring all that data together. I think this is essential. And then we have automatic avoidance systems and so on. Jesse, I totally agree. We need to bring weather data as well as all of available data together, that we can analyze this in a most appropriate way. But as I said, this is exactly what we're currently doing, and the results what we currently have is really amazing. But back to your question, Christian. So from the passenger drone perspective, we would not like to sell the vehicle. We always want to also operate them. So we are an OEM as well as an operator. Mm-hmm. Of course, I think it will always be kind of joint ventures with experienced operators like Lufthansa in Germany, for example. We have partnered with Japan Airlines, so there's a reason why, so that we together, so with I think the local who also knows the business, knows the market, that we want together operate the vehicle. It is for us too dangerous that we just give away the vehicle and someone else uses in the wrong way. I think this could kill a company. With a Volo drone, so our heavy lift drone, we have a little bit of different approach. At the beginning, we think about the same approach, that we do joint ventures for an operation, mainly to learn. But in the long run, then we will also sell it, but only to other, I would call it experienced partners who know or then also operate it. But on the other hand, for example, this is also what you mentioned, the Volo drone could also operate on a field outside with an unmanned area. So there it would be quite easier to operate it without any risk.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you very much, Ralph, for that. There's another question, and I'm trying to make this interactive. I hope that's fine for you from the audience. I think we briefly touched on that already. It's if the price is not too high, the demand for UAM will be decisive. How big can the demand to an air taxi station be during rush hours, and how can it be managed? And I agree with it. If we in mega cities, for example, that suffer a lot under congestion, this might become, that's going to be great for you. This might become reality. So how are you going to deal with that? But maybe both Ralph and Felix or everyone.
So what we think, that there will be that the customer will have an app, and then you can book the flight. I think on demand, I don't know, this might happen later, but I think a long time later, at the beginning, there will be a dedicated flight. So there's a flight schedule and so on. At the beginning, we also need a pilot. We do not start autonomously. So therefore, we need this, I think, flight properly set up. And therefore, a customer would apply for this flight. He says he can an app, he can book the flight and then come to the port and then take the flight. Of course, this is also what Felix mentioned before. It should be much easier to don't do that you do not need to wait an hour until boarding. This should be much quicker. I think this is a great advantage. But from a general perspective, it is similar, at least at the beginning, I think, to conventional flight as well from the procedure.
Thank you very much, Ralph. You know, one question from my side, Felix, for you, and obviously I'm very interested in that, and I wasn't sure I could be asking you that question, but as you are representing Frankfurt Airport, you know, when actually will we be seeing the first drones, copters, VTOL flying from Frankfurt Airport? And will there be, you know, drones, you know, I already asked you that question, obviously into the city, you answered that, something like the main train station and so on, but will it also go outside the cities into the, you know, areas around Frankfurt? But when do we actually see it happening?
Okay, so in terms of smaller drones, you can already see drones in everyday operations at Frankfurt Airport since a few years, I think since 2018, because we already integrated some of those for construction surveying tasks. But coming back to the air taxi area, I think, I mean, I would hope that we will be faster than our friends in Paris for the Olympic Games, but I think it's realistic to say that the first operations will start in mid 2020s, and of course we are not thinking about Frankfurt only. We are still checking destinations in the whole Rhine-Main area, which includes Wiesbaden, Darmstadt, for example. And but we expect that Frankfurt will be the city with the highest demand, especially in the beginning.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you, Felix. A question to you, Philip, from the audience. Reflecting on Philip's comments around a massive digitally connected systems and reliance on data sharing, how do you see the cyber issues being addressed when one vulnerability could impact the safety of so many aircraft, and how will this work across so many different players in such a system of systems? And I think that was referring to what Ralph said as well.
Yeah, there's going to have to be two sorts of data. One is going to be safety related data, where you have to have a trusted certificate. So in other words, it has to be regulated, and we've already seen the International Civil Aviation Organization, which is the global aviation regulator, come up with this idea of certificated trusted data, and you get a kind of like a kite mark, where you get some kind of special data format which shows it's been validated and it's safety related. So you have that. Then you have operational data and you have commercial data, and so you have all these different layers of data flying around using similar platforms, some sharing them, some not. But the regulated data, the key safety regulated data, has to be on a different platform with a different kind of certification, a different kind of validation system than the other two sets, as it is today in air traffic management.
Yeah, and you know, just one question, you know, just in connection to that from the audience in regards to distributing and, you know, the ability to access that huge amount of data, you know, in regard of the landing sites, etc. You know, Ralph, maybe you can add to that a little bit, because that's something I think
I did not totally understand the last question right now.
I said, you know, obviously, you know, Philip was talking about the, you know, security aspects of that vast amount of data as well. And there was a question from the audience: how do you plan on distributing and accessing data about the huge amount of landing sites that should appear with the development of UAM?
I think that also regarding the investment, what we're currently doing in the VoloIQ is that the data security is, I think, one of the biggest points anyhow. This is where it should be really put in a budget, a big budget, that it could be totally secure. And Philip, you just said this. Today we already have data, certified data on flights, that of course this is absolutely necessary to take care about this, that it has the highest security issues there. And yeah, I think this will be a task about also when we think about the shared airspace. So it will not only be volocopters, it will be Liliums, it will be others, it will be helicopters and so on. How to tackle this, that also the data needs to be exchanged, so that we also know from each other, but already we have already tested this as well. For example, so in Helsinki, when we flew at the Helsinki airport, we were already part of the air traffic management system, so that we were seen there as well as the biggest aircraft were seeing us. So it is possible there. I still think regarding from the complexity, when you, for example, compare this with autonomous vehicles on the street, it is still easier because you simply have autopilots are already today flying, so this is already existing. With autonomous vehicles, you have also, I think, it might be difficult. I have always this in mind when you have a vehicle is coming and then you have pedestrians crossing. What would this autonomous vehicle need to decide? Okay, we cannot avoid an incident. So what should this be? What should the vehicle be do? I think this might also be easier in the air. So I think autonomous flying at the end, it's much easier than autonomous driving. But we of course can benefit from the existing development, what is happening in the autonomous driving world. So I think also a lot of when we think about our developers and so on, there is also, I think, a lot of interest from the automotive world to also be part of our development.
Yeah, probably, yeah. So, the thing I'm most amazed of, I have to say, is, just by my perception, what we're talking since years about autonomous vehicles, etc. And, I still don't know any city really where that's completely being implemented in real life yet globally. And while, what we're seeing currently on the urban air mobility side, we've been seeing, your Volocopters, Ralph, flying around in Singapore, and you mentioned the other cities, Dubai, Helsinki, and so on. So there really seems to be an extremely high or strong power behind it at the moment. One last question to Jesse. If you would need to make a bet, Jesse, where do we see that first becoming a reality, in the US or in Europe?
Well, I would say a quick warning first. The first urban air mobility shut down in 1979. They were called New York Airways, and they were moving hundreds of people around the city of New York every week. So they were flying from downtown to JFK to LaGuardia, and they had one crash on top of the Pan Am building, and shortly thereafter, they were out of business. So I can't, I just want to put it out there that this is incredibly hard, and that the whole industry will have to work together, because if there's one crash in one major city, it's over for everybody. And so I would say, instead of US versus Europe, we all need to work together and make sure these are safe enough, because if they're not, this will not be a viable industry.
I love that statement, because at the end of the day, we're also talking about safety of the citizens, etc. So I think that's a great statement to end with. So with that, I'd like to thank you, first of all, for joining that panel today. I'd like to thank the audience for joining us today. Please have a look at the Shaping Mobility webinars webpage. You'll be seeing what's coming up next as well. I wish you a wonderful morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are. Thank you very much for joining again. The questions that we didn't answer will be answered in the next day, so please don't worry about that. Have a fantastic day, everyone. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.